The Yalari were not a warrior species. Everyone in the galaxy knew that. They were small bird-like creatures with hollow bones and wide golden eyes that caught light in a way that made them look like they were always thinking about something beautiful. They built libraries instead of warships. They mapped stars instead of claiming them. They sang to each other across open frequencies, long harmonic transmissions that other species sometimes stopped to listen to, even if they did not understand the words. They had been a member of the Galactic Conclave for over 3,000 years. They had never once voted for military action against anyone. That was why the Vreth chose them. The Vreth Dominion was everything the Yalari were not. They were tall, scaled, cold-blooded in both body and decision. They had built their empire over centuries by picking targets that could not fight back, and moving before the Conclave could react. By the time a resolution was drafted, and a committee was formed, and ambassadors were assigned, the Vreth had already taken what they wanted. They understood the Conclave perfectly. They knew it ran on procedure, and procedure took time, and time was all they needed. The first attack came on a quiet morning on the Yalari colony of Velsori, a green world with shallow blue oceans and forests that grew in perfect spirals. There was no warning, no declaration, no message sent to the Conclave. The Vreth fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel inside the colony's orbit and opened fire within seconds. Velsori burned for 6 hours. The second colony, Arin's Perch, fell the following day. The Yalari evacuation ships that tried to flee were targeted first. The Vreth were not interested in prisoners. They were not interested in territory. They were interested in removal. A Vreth commander had said it privately, in a message later recovered and translated. A species that survives remembers. We do not want them to remember. The third colony, Kepler's Vale, was the largest. It had over 7 billion Yalari living on it. It had universities, hospitals, music halls, an observatory dome that could be seen from orbit. Built entirely from a pale silver material the Yalari had developed themselves. The dome had taken 40 years to build. It lasted 4 minutes against Vreth bombardment. By the time the emergency signal reached the Conclave station, all 3 colonies were gone. 12 billion Yalari were dead. The ones who survived were the ones who had been off-world. Students on exchange programs, diplomats, a few traders, the Yalari ambassador herself. A small and trembling figure named Tisali, who received the news in a conclave corridor and sat down on the floor and could not stand back up for a very long time. The conclave emergency chamber was called to session within hours. 400 species sent their representatives. The room was enormous, built in a wide oval, with tiered seating that rose toward a glass ceiling, through which the stars were always visible. It was designed that way on purpose, a reminder, the founders had said, that every decision made in that room affected the sky above. The debates began. Some species called for immediate sanctions. Others worried about escalation. A few pointed out that the Vreth Dominion controlled key trade corridors and that economic disruption would affect member worlds far beyond the conflict zone. A delegation from the Keth, one of the oldest species in the conclave, suggested a formal inquiry before any action was taken, to ensure all facts were properly established. The Vreth ambassador sat in his seat with his arms folded and said nothing. He had attended 3 sessions like this before. He knew how they ended. High Warlord Sarak, the commander who had ordered the attacks, transmitted a message to the conclave on the second day of debate. It was short. It said, "We will discuss terms when the weak have been removed from the equation. Schedule your summit for 6 months from now. We will attend." There were 17 formal protests filed before the session ended. Then the conclave secretariat announced that yes, a summit would be scheduled, pending a full review of all submitted complaints. 6 months from now. Tessali, the Yalari ambassador, listened to the announcement from the back of the chamber. She did not cry. She had already cried everything she had. She sat very still and stared at the floor. Someone sat down beside her. It was Elena Vasquez, the human ambassador. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s, with short gray hair and dark eyes that had the particular quality of someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. She wore the standard Terran diplomatic uniform, dark blue, no decorations. She did not say anything for a while. She just sat there next to Tessely, which was, in the circumstances, more than most people had done. After a long silence, Tessely spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. They are going to let them sit at the table, after everything. Vasquez did not answer right away. She looked across the chamber at the Vreth ambassador, who was now speaking quietly to one of his aides, looking relaxed, looking like a being who had already won. Yes, Vasquez said, they are. Tessely turned to look at her. And the humans? What will the humans do? Vasquez stood. She straightened her jacket. She looked down at Tessely with an expression that was not angry, not loud, not dramatic. It was simply certain. The expression of someone standing on a position so solid they did not need to shout about it. Watch, she said. The next session opened, with the conclave chair calling attendance from all member delegations. Species by species, the responses came in. When the chair reached the Terran delegation, there was a pause. The chair called again. Vasquez was already standing in the center of the room. Every eye, every sensor, every camera turned toward her. The chamber went quiet, in the way that large rooms go quiet when something unexpected is about to happen. She looked around slowly. She took her time. She made sure every ambassador in that room was looking at her before she spoke. And then she said, in a voice that was calm and clear, and carried to every corner of the chamber without effort, "The humans will not be attending the summit." She turned and walked out. The doors closed behind her. For a full 10 seconds, no one in the chamber said anything at all. Then everyone spoke at once. The Vreth ambassador unfolded his arms for the first time all session. The Keth elder tilted its ancient head. The conclave chair called for order 3 times before the room settled. Out in the corridor, Tessely had followed Vasquez. She caught up with her near the exit, breathing fast, her golden eyes wide. "What does that mean?" she asked. "What are you going to do?" Vasquez paused at the door. She looked back once at the chamber, at the noise and the confusion, and the 400 species all trying to understand what had just happened. "What we always do," she said, "when someone murders our friends." Then she walked out into the dark of the station corridor, already reaching for her comm. The news of Vasquez's walkout traveled faster than any official report. By the time she reached the Terran embassy on Conclave Station Prime, the story had already been picked up by 43 separate interstellar news feeds. Footage of the moment, her standing in the center of the chamber, speaking those 7 words, walking out, was being replayed on screens across 6 star systems before she had even taken off her jacket. Most species found it confusing. A few found it amusing. The general opinion among senior conclave diplomats, delivered in careful and diplomatic language, was that humanity had made a dramatic gesture that ultimately changed nothing. The summit would still happen. The Vreth would still attend. And eventually, as always, things would settle into procedure. The Vreth Dominion did not even issue a formal response. An aide to High Warlord Serac was quoted briefly on a Dominion state channel, saying that humanity's reaction was emotional and expected from a young species still learning how interstellar affairs actually work. They were not worried. That was their first mistake. 48 hours after Vasquez walked out of the chamber, the Terran Interstellar Command released a document on all public conclave channels. It was not a declaration of war. It was not a military ultimatum. It was a policy document, formally titled Directive Aurum 7, and it was written in plain galactic standard, with no legal complexity, no diplomatic softening, and no room for interpretation. It said, in its core clause, the Terran Union does not negotiate with, extend diplomatic recognition to, or offer the protections of conclave procedure to any governing body that has committed, ordered, or permitted acts of genocide against any sentient species. Such entities are classified as unclean powers. This classification carries no appeals process. It does not expire. It is not subject to revision based on new leadership, political change, or offers of reparation made after the fact. An unclean power remains an unclean power until the Terran Union determines otherwise, and the Terran Union alone determines otherwise. The document was 3 pages long. It referenced the Conclave's Sentience Accords in 4 places, citing specific clauses that strip diplomatic immunity from governments found guilty of mass civilian killing. Clauses that had existed for 9,000 years and had never once been enforced by anyone. By the end of the first day, 17 species had sent urgent messages to the Terran embassy requesting clarification. Did this mean war? Did this mean humans would be leaving the Conclave entirely? Was this a negotiating position? Was there a back channel? Was someone they could speak to? The embassy staff responded to each message with the same single line. Directive Aurum 7 is self-explanatory. The Terran Union has no further comment at this time. On the second day, a delegation of 4 senior Conclave ambassadors arrived in person at the embassy. They were shown into a meeting room. Vasquez joined them, along with 2 aides. Tea was served. The senior ambassador, a broad, gray-furred being from the Morath Collective, named Ambassador Voss, leaned forward and spoke carefully. Ambassador Vasquez, we understand that the Yalari situation has caused significant distress. The Conclave shares that distress, but we must ask you to consider the wider consequences of this directive. The Vreth control the Kessler Corridor. 12 member species depend on that corridor for food imports alone. A military confrontation? We haven't announced a military confrontation, Vasquez said. Voss paused. Then what exactly have you announced? A policy, she said. We don't sit at tables with murderers. That's the policy. It's not new. We told the Conclave 11 years ago, after the Pell Outpost incident, that if the Vreth did something like this again, we would not participate in negotiations with them. We said it clearly. We said it in this station, in that chamber, on the record. Voss shifted uncomfortably. That was understood to be a strong expression of concern. It was understood wrong, Vasquez said. With humans, when we say something, we mean it. That is something the Conclave has had difficulty accepting, and that is not our problem to solve. The meeting ended shortly after. Nothing was resolved. The delegation left looking unsettled in the particular way of people who have realized, too late, that they misread a situation entirely. While the diplomatic meetings were happening on Conclave Station Prime, something else was happening 40 light-years away. Admiral Jonah Reeves was a tall man with a quiet manner, and the kind of stillness that came not from calm, but from absolute focus. He had commanded the Terran Third Fleet for 6 years. His fleet was not the largest in the Terran military. It was not the newest, but it was the most experienced, and it was the one that had spent the last 8 months quietly repositioning itself along the edge of Terran space, nearest to Vreth territory. A repositioning that had been approved, funded, and executed before the Yalari colonies were even attacked. Because humanity had been watching the Vreth for a long time. The Third Fleet moved out of its staging position on the 3rd day after Directive Aurum 7 was released. No announcement was made, no message was sent to the Vreth, no ultimatum, no demand for surrender or withdrawal. The fleet simply began moving through Vreth-adjacent space at maximum sustainable speed, every ship running full power to drives and weapon systems, every crew at operational readiness. Other species listening posts picked up the movement within hours. The reports that came back were confused at first, then alarmed. Ships were being counted, formations were being identified, analysts were running projections. They're heading for the Vreth border, a Keth military observer reported to the Conclave Security Council. No communication, no stated objective, no, a pause. They haven't sent any demands to the Vreth at all. The council member who received the report read it twice. None, she said. None, the observer confirmed. In 11,000 years of Conclave history, every military action had been preceded by demands. Demands were the point. They gave the other side a chance to back down, which meant the conflict could be resolved at the table, which was where all conflicts were supposed to be resolved. Demands were the beginning of negotiation. Negotiation was the purpose of everything. The humans had sent no demands because they were not interested in negotiation. They had classified the Vreth as an unclean power. You did not negotiate with an unclean power. You did not send it ultimatums or give it chances. You treated it as something that had placed itself outside the protections of civilized procedure, because it had. You dealt with it the way you dealt with a fire, not by talking to it, by putting it out. Back on Conclave Station Prime, Tessali found Vasquez in the embassy garden, a small enclosed space with earth plants growing under artificial light, which the humans maintained with the quiet stubbornness of people who insisted on carrying a piece of home wherever they went. Tessali stood at the entrance for a moment, watching Vasquez water a low green plant with careful attention. "The fleet is moving," Tessali said. "Yes," said Vasquez. "When did you order it?" Vasquez set down the watering container. She looked at Tessali with that same steady expression. Not cold, not warm, just certain. "Before we came to the summit," she said, "before your colonies were attacked, we had intelligence that the Vreth were planning something. We made a decision then. If they crossed that line, we would not argue about it afterward. We would act." Tessali was quiet for a long moment. Outside the embassy garden, through the walls, the entire conclave station hummed with noise, debates, arguments, emergency sessions, species trying to process what was happening. "The galaxy thinks you're being reckless," Tessali said finally. Vasquez picked up the watering container again. "The galaxy has been watching your people die for years, and calling it complexity. We call it what it is." She went back to watering the plant. The fleet kept moving. High Warlord Sarak had won 14 battles in his lifetime. He was not a particularly brilliant commander. What he was experienced in a very specific kind of war, the kind where the other side eventually wanted to stop fighting. Every enemy he had ever faced had at some point decided that continuing to lose was worse than making a deal. That moment, when the enemy reached for the communication channel, was the moment Sarak considered himself to have truly won. The fighting before it was just preparation. When his intelligence officers told him that a Terran fleet was crossing into Vreth space without sending any demands, his first reaction was professional curiosity. "They want better terms," he said. "They're establishing a stronger position before they open talks. It's a pressure tactic." His senior tactician, a scarred veteran named Subcommander Vrail, was less certain. "Warlord, they haven't opened any channel at all, not even a standard military identification ping. They're running completely silent." "Then they'll open one soon," Sarak said. "Everyone does." He sent a standard conclave format negotiation request to the Terran fleet. It was a formal document, correctly structured, offering to discuss reparations and establish a ceasefire framework. It was exactly the kind of message that had ended 3 of Sarak's previous conflicts. He sent it and then went to have his evening meal. The Terran fleet logged the message, filed it in a low-priority queue, and continued its approach at maximum burn. When Sarak was told the next morning that no response had come, he sent a second message. More conciliatory this time. He offered specific figures. He suggested a neutral location for talks. He invoked conclave mediation procedures by name. The fleet continued moving. It entered weapons range of the Vreth forward station at Sarak's Pride, a massive military installation named in the tradition of Vreth commanders after himself. The station had heavy shielding, an armed garrison of 40,000 soldiers, and an orbital defense grid that had never been tested in actual combat, because no one had ever been willing to attack it. Admiral Reeves looked at the tactical display and spent exactly 40 seconds studying it. "Standard penetration pattern," he said to his bridge crew. "Take the defense grid first, then the command nodes, then the shipyard, in that order, nothing else." His crew moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had trained for this exact situation and were not afraid of it. There were no speeches, no dramatic pauses. The Third Fleet adjusted its formation and began its approach and opened fire. The Vreth defenders responded immediately and with everything they had. They were not poorly trained, they were not cowardly. They fought hard, and for the first hour the battle was genuinely contested. Vreth gunners found their marks. 2 human destroyers took serious damage. 1 had to pull back. But there was a difference that became apparent in the second hour, and it was a difference that Vreel noticed before anyone else on the Vreth side did. The humans were not trying to hold ground. They were not trying to demonstrate strength or establish a threatening position or signal a willingness to escalate. They were not doing any of the things that military forces did when they were fighting to gain leverage. They were systematically taking apart the station's ability to function. Every target they chose was a working part of something. The defense grid went down in segments, each segment carefully disabled before the next was touched. The communication arrays went silent one by one. The power relays that fed the garrison's internal systems were hit with a precision that suggested the humans had very detailed schematics of the station, which, Vreel realized with a cold feeling, they almost certainly did. "They're not fighting us," Vreel said to himself, watching the tactical display. "They're dismantling us." He reached for the command channel to request a ceasefire, then stopped himself. Because asking for a ceasefire meant starting a negotiation. And the humans had made it very clear that they were not here to negotiate. He sent the request anyway. 40,000 soldiers were depending on him to try everything. The response came back in 11 minutes. Not from Admiral Reeves, from a communications officer, which was itself a message. The text was short. "Terran Command does not recognize ceasefire requests from unclean powers. Continue evacuation of non-combatant personnel if able." That last sentence stopped Vreel completely. He read it 3 times. Continue evacuation of non-combatant personnel if able. The humans were telling them to get their civilians out. In the middle of a battle. They were pausing targeting on the station's civilian corridors. Vreel checked. And yes, the humans were actively avoiding 3 entire sections of the station that housed support staff and their families, to give them time to evacuate. They were fighting with enough precision to do that, to win a battle and simultaneously avoid killing people they had decided did not deserve to die. Vreel had never encountered anything like it. The battle lasted 19 hours in total. By the end, the station's military capacity was 0. The defense grid was gone. The shipyard was rubble. Every command note was dark. The garrison had suffered heavy losses, but the civilian sections were intact, and the evacuation ships that had launched in the 3rd hour of battle had been allowed to pass through the human formation without being touched. Zarak's flagship, the Crimson Ascendancy, had been in orbit above the station. When the last defense node went down, it tried to make an emergency jump to faster-than-light travel. The Terran fleet had anticipated exactly that. 3 ships had been positioned specifically to prevent it. The Crimson Ascendancy was disabled before it could reach jump distance. Its engines sheared off with the kind of surgical precision that left the rest of the hull and the people inside it intact. Sarak found himself sitting in a powerless ship in the middle of debris, watching a human fleet move through his station's wreckage like they owned it, which at this point they effectively did. He sent a ceasefire request. He sent 14 more over the next 6 hours. Each one went unanswered. A Vreth Vice Admiral, commanding the remnants of the Dominion's response fleet that had arrived too late to change anything, broadcast a ceasefire on all frequencies, including the Conclave emergency band, begging the Conclave to intervene, to mediate, to do something. Admiral Reeves' response was clean and short, and broadcast on the same open frequency so that every listening post within range could hear it. There is no peace to broker here. The Conclave is not part of this action. What is happening is not a war. It is a consequence. Consequences do not have ceasefire negotiations. They simply happen. Across 6 star systems, that transmission was received and recorded. Military analysts listened to it multiple times. Diplomats read it with expressions ranging from unease to something close to fear. One analyst at a Keth observation post, a young researcher on her first deep space assignment, turned to her senior colleague after reading the transcript. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It's a consequence, not a war?" The senior researcher was quiet for a moment, thinking about it. I think, he said slowly, it means they made up their minds before it started. It means for them, the decision phase is over. They're not fighting to win something. They already decided what the result would be, making it happen. The young researcher looked back at her screen, at the data showing the systematic destruction of the Vreth military installation, piece by piece. No waste, no excess. That's more frightening than a war, she said. Her colleague nodded. Yes, he said. I think that's the point. The conclave chamber had seen many crises in its 11,000 years. It had seen wars declared and ended. It had seen species collapse and species rise. It had seen arguments so heated that the translation systems could not keep up, and negotiations so long that the diplomats involved had to be rotated out for rest. It had, on 2 occasions, seen member species storm out in anger, only to return quietly 6 months later when the anger had cooled. It had never seen anything like this. The emergency session called on the 4th day of the Terran campaign was the loudest gathering in the chamber's recent history. Representatives were shouting over each other before the session was even formally opened. The chair called for order 6 times before the room dropped below a level where speech was possible. Then everyone tried to speak at once again. The core of the problem was simple and for the conclave, deeply unsettling. There was nothing in their law that allowed them to stop what the humans were doing. Legal scholars had been working through the night, pulling up 11,000 years of conclave statute and treaty law, searching for a mechanism, a clause, a precedent. Anything that could be used to formally demand a halt to Terran military action. The humans had not declared war, which meant the conclave's war mediation protocols did not apply. They had not violated any Terran treaty because they had no active treaty obligations with the Vreth. They had classified the Vreth as an unclean power, which meant all standard diplomatic frameworks had been formally suspended. And the Vreth themselves had, by committing genocide, technically violated the Conclave Sentience Accords, which stripped them of the full protections of Conclave law. That last point was the one that kept stopping the legal scholars cold. The Sentience Accords had been written 9,000 years ago, following a terrible conflict that had scarred 3 star systems and left 2 species extinct. They were the bedrock of conclave law, and they said, clearly, in language that had been considered so obvious it had never needed enforcing, that any governing body found to have committed deliberate mass killing of a sentient species lost its standing under conclave protection. The Vreth had done exactly that. The humans had simply read the law and acted on it. They're using our own founding documents against us, said Ambassador Voss, his gray fur bristling with a combination of anger and something that might have been reluctant admiration. Or rather, they're using them correctly. They're the first species in 9,000 years to actually use them correctly. It sets a precedent, said a thin, blue-skinned delegate from the Uran Compact. If this is allowed to stand, it already stands, interrupted the Keth elder, Counselor Orath, from the far end of the chamber. His voice was very old, and very slow, and carried the particular weight of something that had been present for a great deal of history. The question of whether to allow it is no longer available to us. It is happening. Our discussion should be about what it means, not about how to reverse it. The room went somewhat quieter. When Orath spoke, even the loudest delegates tended to settle. He had been in this chamber for 300 years. His species lived very long lives, and he had used his well. What it means, he continued, is that we have, for 11,000 years, treated our founding law as a statement of values rather than a set of rules. We pass resolutions, we issue condemnations, we schedule summits. We believe very strongly in the importance of this. He paused. The humans believe in consequences. 20 delegates tried to respond at once. The chair let them talk for a moment, then called order again. In the middle of all this, on the 14th day of the campaign, Vasquez returned to the chamber. She hadn't attended a single session since her walkout. Her absence had been noted, analyzed, and argued about in every corridor of the station. Some species had read it as arrogance, others as a deliberate signal. The Vreth ambassador, who had initially been confident and dismissive, had stopped attending sessions himself on the 9th day, which was the day the third major Vreth military installation fell. When Vasquez walked in, the chamber went quiet. She walked to the Terran delegation seat, sat down, folded her hands on the desk in front of her, and waited. She did not look triumphant. She did not look angry. She looked like someone who had come to finish a meeting that had been interrupted. The chair opened the session. When it came to the human delegation's turn to speak, Vasquez stood. "Ambassador Vasquez," said the chair carefully, "the conclave would appreciate an explanation of Terran actions in Vret space." "I am happy to explain," Vasquez said. 11 years ago, the Vreth Dominion destroyed the Pell outpost. 312 beings died. The conclave's response was a trade sanction lasting 8 months, after which the Vreth were readmitted to full conclave participation. At that session, the Terran delegation filed a formal statement. It said that the Terran Union would not, in the future, participate in diplomatic processes that treated mass killing as a negotiating inconvenience. It said that if the Vreth committed another such act, we would respond with action, not procedure. That statement is in the official conclave record. It has been there for 11 years. She paused. "We meant it," she said simply. "We always mean what we say." Councillor Orath leaned forward. His voice was quiet enough that the room had to go still to hear him. "Ambassador, you say humans always mean what they say. Is that truly possible? Every species uses language as a tool of negotiation. Every species says things it does not fully intend." Vasquez looked at the old Keth councillor. Something in her expression softened, very slightly, the way it does when you find a question genuinely worth answering. "We say things we don't intend sometimes," she said. "We're not perfect. But when we issue a formal policy statement to this body, in this room, on the official record, we intend it. Every word. Because we believe that words without intention behind them are how you end up with 11,000 years of resolutions that nobody enforces, and murderers who know exactly how long your process takes." The silence in the room was the kind that meant people were thinking rather than just waiting to speak. The Vreth ambassador, who had returned for this session, sat very still. He was not a foolish being. He had begun to understand, in the last 2 weeks, that he had made a serious error. Not of military judgment, but of reading. He had read the humans as he read everyone else. He had been wrong. Tasali sat in the observer gallery above the main floor. She was no longer the only Yalari in the station. In the 2 weeks since the campaign began, 43 surviving Yalari had made their way to Conclave Station Prime from various places across the galaxy. Students, traders, diplomats, a family that had been on a transport when Kepler's veil was destroyed. They had gathered here because there was nowhere else to go. Tasali had become, without planning to, something like a leader for them. She had organized food and temporary housing. She had filed paperwork to establish a temporary Yulari office in the station. She watched Vasquez from the gallery. She had not fully cried since the first day. She was not sure she could. But watching the human ambassador stand in that room and say plainly, and without performance, "We meant it. We always mean what we say," she felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a word for. Not happiness, not yet. Something more like the first breath after a long time underwater. After the session, the Keth elder found Vasquez in the corridor outside the chamber. He moved slowly, supported by 2 aides, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "I have one question," he said. "Of course," said Vasquez. "When you walked out of the chamber," he said, "on that first day, did you already know the fleet was moving?" Vasquez met his eyes. "Yes," she said. Orath was quiet for a moment. "Then the walkout was not a protest," he said. "It was a closing statement." Vasquez almost smiled. "Counselor," she said, "with humans, it always is." She nodded to him and walked on down the corridor, already looking at her calm, already thinking about what came next. Behind her, Orath stood very still for a long moment, 300 years of history running through his ancient mind. Then he turned to one of his aides. "Find me the original text of the Sentience Accords," he said quietly. "All of them. I think it is time we read them properly." The Vreth Dominion did not fall. That was the thing that surprised everyone, including privately a few people within the Terran military who had not been fully briefed on the exact parameters of the campaign. When the Third Fleet stopped its advance and held its position at the edge of the Vreth's core systems, the listening posts across the galaxy picked up the news with a mixture of relief and confusion. Analysts had been running projections for days, calculating how long it would take humanity to push through to the Vreth homeworld, modeling population figures, making guesses about occupation timelines. The fleet stopped. It held its line, and it waited. The Vreth military was gone. Not destroyed in the sense of every ship burned and every soldier dead, but dismantled. Shipyards were rubble. Command infrastructure was offline. Weapons platforms had been taken apart with such thorough precision that they could not be reassembled without years of industrial effort. The Dominion's ability to project force beyond its own borders had been reduced to zero. But the cities were untouched. The farms were untouched. The schools, the hospitals, the homes of ordinary Vreth citizens who had lived their lives under a warlord they had not chosen, and whose orders they had not given, untouched. A young Thalessi diplomat named Sue Rahl was among the many observers trying to understand what had happened. She was 26 years old, and had been assigned to the Conclave Station as a junior attaché barely 8 months before. She had expected her first posting to involve meetings about trade agreements and procedural amendments to water rights treaties. Instead, she had watched the most significant military action in 3 centuries unfold from a press room on the station's second level, surviving on bad coffee and increasingly long shifts. She had filed 43 reports. She had attended 11 emergency sessions. She had developed opinions about every species' response to the crisis, and the one she kept returning to was the humans, because she could not fully make sense of them. She requested a meeting with Vasquez. She expected to be redirected to a communications officer. Instead, 2 days later, she received a simple reply. Thursday, 1400 hours, Embassy Garden. Bring your actual questions. The garden was small and quiet, and smelled like something Sue Rahl could not identify. Something green and warm, and very far from space. Vasquez was already there when she arrived, sitting on a low bench, reading something on a handheld screen. Sue Rahl sat across from her. She had prepared carefully. She had a list. But the first question that came out of her mouth was not the one she had prepared. "Why did you stop?" she said. Vasquez looked up from her screen. "You had them," Sue Rahl said. "Their military was gone. Their warlord was sitting in a dead ship. You could have taken everything, their space, their resources. You could have absorbed the whole Dominion. Every projection said you could. Why did you stop?" Vasquez set down the screen. She looked at Sue Rahl the way that experienced people sometimes look at young people, not with condescension, but with the particular attention of someone deciding how honest to be. "Because we're not them," she said. Sue Rahl waited. "The Vreth killed 12 billion people," Vasquez said. "Civilians, beings who had never harmed anyone. We went there to destroy the capacity that allowed that to happen. The military, the warlord's power base, the infrastructure that makes that kind of attack possible. We destroyed all of that. Then we stopped, because everything beyond that line would be us punishing people for existing in the wrong place under the wrong government. And that is exactly what we just spent 19 hours and a great deal of blood fighting against." Sue Rahl was quiet for a moment. "And Serac?" "In custody," Vasquez said. "He and his senior commanders will be tried under the Sentience Accords. There is now, thanks to Counselor Orath, and about 6 months of very intensive legal work, an actual court capable of doing that." Sue Rahl nodded slowly. She looked down at her list and chose a different question. "With the Vreth, with the Dominion, what is the plan?" "They rebuild," Vasquez said. "Without a military, without Serac, under close observation for the next several decades. The Conclave will administer the transition. They'll be treated as a protectorate, not a conquest. That was part of what we agreed before the campaign started. You agreed that with the conclave? No, Vasquez said. We agreed it with ourselves. Then we informed the conclave. There is a difference. Sural sat with that for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been underneath all the others, the one she had not quite been able to form until now. Did you ever doubt it? She said. Any of it? Walking out of the chamber, the fleet moving, all of it. Did any of you think, maybe we should wait? Maybe there's another way? Maybe we're moving too fast? Vasquez was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Sural thought she might not answer. Yes, she said finally. Of course. Every decision at this scale carries doubt. The question is not whether you feel doubt. The question is whether the doubt changes the right answer. And the right answer did not change. She picked up her screen again, then paused. 12 billion people, Sural. I let myself feel the doubt, and then I thought about 12 billion people, and then I made the call. Sural left the embassy garden with a great deal to think about. 6 months later, the conclave passed Resolution 7 Aurum. It was the first new foundational law the conclave had added to its core statutes in over 2,000 years. It drew directly from the existing Sentience Accords, formalizing what had always technically been there, but had never been enforced. It created a permanent tribunal with the authority to strip conclave protections from any governing body found guilty of genocide. It established a rapid response review process that could be triggered by any 3 member species. It set out, in clear and binding language, exactly what happened when someone crossed the line that the Accords had always drawn but never defended. Councillor Orath drafted most of it personally. He had, as he told his aides, spent 300 years watching good law go unenforced because everyone assumed someone else would enforce it. He did not intend to leave another generation with the same excuse. During the final vote, every member species voted in favor. Even the species that had been most alarmed by the Terran campaign. Even the ones who had spent 6 months arguing that humanity had overstepped. When the moment came to put their name on a law that said, clearly and without diplomatic softening, that murder has consequences, no one voted no. The resolution was named formally after its statute number. Informally, in the press, in the corridors of the station, in the reports that circulated across 6 star systems, it was called something else. The Human Clause. Nobody used the formal name much after the first week. Sally was there for the vote. She sat in the observer gallery, in the same seat she had occupied on the day the colonies burned. And she watched 400 species raise their hands one by one. When the final count was announced, she did not cheer, she did not cry. She sat very still, and breathed, and let the reality of it settle in her. After the session ended, Vasquez found her in the corridor. The 2 of them walked together through the station without speaking for a while, past windows that looked out into the black and the distant stars. Eventually, Sally spoke. Do you think it will hold, she said. The resolution, the law, do you think it changes anything really? Vasquez considered the question seriously. I think, she said, that it changes what is on the record. And what is on the record is what the next warlord will have to look at when they are deciding whether to do what Serac did. And next to the record, there will be the memory of what happened at Serac's Pride. And that combination, law and memory, is harder to ignore than either one alone. Tessely looked out through the station window at the stars. You know what I keep thinking about? She said. All those years, my people were in the conclave. 3,000 years. We voted, we argued, we filed reports, we believed in procedure. A long pause. And it did nothing. One fleet of humans did what 3,000 years of procedure could not. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. Your people believed in something worth protecting, she said. That is not nothing. That is the reason it was worth protecting. Out across the galaxy, in war rooms and command centers, and the private offices of the powerful, old plans were being reviewed. Old contingencies were being reopened, studied, and quietly closed. Species that had once looked at weaker neighbors and calculated the cost of aggression were recalculating, adding a new variable to an old equation. Not the law. Laws could be worked around. But the memory of 19 hours at Sarek's Pride, the image of a human fleet that did not ask, did not demand, did not negotiate, that simply arrived and made good on a promise spoken 11 years before. That was not a variable that was easy to dismiss. In the end, what the galaxy learned was not that humanity was more powerful, or more righteous, or more right than anyone else. What the galaxy learned was something simpler, and in its simplicity, far more unsettling. When humans said something, they meant it. And when they made a promise to remember, they never forgot.